There is a bit of an argument forming among politicians in Canada, and I seem to have been caught in the middle of it. So help me out, let me know in the comments. Who do you think is right here? On one hand, you have Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, who posted this tweet that says the IMF expects Canada's economy to grow at the fastest rate in the G7 next year. And then shortly after that, Pierre Poilievre posted this image on Instagram from a OECD report that shows Canada is expected to have the lowest real GDP per capita growth in the OECD between now and 2030. So the question becomes, who is correct here? And the answer might surprise you. If I go over to the IMF website, we can pretty easily find the answer in the report that Chrystia Freeland is actually citing with her remarks. On the IMF website, there's a press release. I'm trying my best to ignore the fact here that it says the Canadian economy appears to have achieved a soft landing. Very quick refresher for the unfamiliar. A soft landing occurs when an economy sustains a mild slowdown where a consumer and investment spending softens but continues to register positive growth. A hard landing describes a recession with a sharp contraction in spending resulting in many workers losing their jobs and companies significantly reducing their capital investments. And so while Canada is able to prop up our soft landing scenario with GDP, the unemployment scenario is going to be really impacted by population growth. And that's probably the key factor to watch. I mean, I guess they're technically not wrong. They go on to say inflation has come down almost to target while a recession has been avoided because our population is growing so much, it's pushing GDP up, and GDP being the primary metric for recession. GDP growth is cushioned by surging immigration even as per capita income has shrunk. They acknowledge that. So anyway, they posted this 129-page report. And there's honestly, it's a really good report. And I would actually say it doesn't really show the soft landing case that they're discussing. Like I used to really like the IMF. I've taken a lot of their courses on edX, which is like a free platform where you can learn about pretty much anything, but they have some great macro courses on there. I've been a huge fan of them, although a lot of other people in the sphere that I'm in seem to not be. So anyway, you get to this page in the report, page 23, and it shows growth in Canada measured by GDP. And then they show here in the bottom left this per capita GDP growth. And you can see here that big jump up that they were talking about in 24 to 25, which Canada's GDP is going to grow. But you can see on a per capita basis, it's actually kind of in the middle of the pack, right? So even if our GDP is leading, if our population is outgrowing it, then on a per capita basis or a per person basis, GDP is not growing as fast as some of these other countries. And then if you cast that, I'm just going to zoom in on this here. If you cast that line out a little bit and look at real GDP growth per capita from 25 to 29, Canada is actually expected to see the lowest per capita GDP growth in the G7. So funny enough, when Chrystia Freeland posted this on Twitter, my comment was now due per capita, and somebody quote tweeted, an economist and journalist at The Hub did an article analyzing exactly what I had requested, which shows here the economic growth and projections for Canada. Despite having the biggest real GDP growth from 2023 in blue here to 2024 in red, we are actually going to be the only country in the G7 that will see a decline in real GDP per capita in 2024. And I'm not trying to be a doomer by saying this. It's just sort of an economic reality. We can be the fastest growing economy in the G7, and I would be upset if we weren't, given how quickly our population is growing. You know, you'd be doing something awfully wrong if your population was growing at 3 or 4% and your GDP wasn't outgrowing all of your peers in the G7. But where the GDP can be skewed up by population growth, GDP per capita can be skewed down by population growth. So when Pierre put out this post on Instagram, he was criticized for it being out of date. This was actually from a 2021 study done by the OECD. And so conveniently, shortly thereafter, Fraser Institute updated these calculations using 2023 OECD data and their current present day calculations. And they came up with basically a GDP and GDP per capita scenario for Canada is expected to lag the OECD on a GDP per capita basis heading forward for the next 30 years. And, a lot of people are like, how can you model out something economically for 60 years, right? Or for 30 years till 2060. And it's really not actually that difficult given the set of assumptions today. Obviously, your model would change when those assumptions change in a year, but today we know where central banks want to keep the inflation rate. And so we know where we can expect inflation to be for 30 years, kind of as close to that as they can possibly keep it. We know that pretty much every politician in Canada that has a chance of winning prime minister wants to see Canada's population grow to 100 million people by the year 2100. And so that works out to a compounded annual growth rate of like 2.5% per year. And we know the growth rate at which advanced economies are capable of continuing growth at based on, the past 100 years of economic data, looking at comparable countries in the G7 or in the OECD. And so given this information, the Fraser Institute calculated that Canada would have the lowest growth rate in per capita GDP in the OECD between 2030 and 2060. So in a roundabout way to answer that question in a roundabout way, who's right here? Is Pierre Poilievre right saying that we have the worst economy when using GDP per capita as is metric? Or is Chrystia Freeland correct in saying that we have the best economy in the G7 using pure GDP metric? The reality is they can both be right. You can have a GDP that is outperforming everybody in the G7, but because your population is growing so quickly on a per capita basis or a per person basis, you can be underperforming everyone else in the G7 or in the OECD. So, I think the IMF, it's kind of funny, right? People will always discredit if you try and post some research from the Fraser Institute because of their political bias, which I think that they are pretty clear that they are right-leaning. The question becomes, is the IMF now falling into this kind of similar world where they're becoming a little bit of a propaganda machine almost for the government? The lines are pretty easy to draw, given that the previous president and CEO of CMHC departed in December of 2023 to pursue a role as director of the Office of Risk Management at the International Monetary Fund. While I actually think the IMF did an excellent report here, I think that their press release really sells it short by already celebrating that Canada might have achieved a soft landing, given we haven't even reached the second inning of our rate cutting cycle. And I try and avoid the partisanism of, Fraser Institute or IMF as an example. And I think it takes away a lot from the great research that actually exists within this report by the IMF, which I would encourage you to use. And it leads me to what I'll wrap up with, which is a recommendation for a book. A very, very quick illustrated book, one of my favorite reads. It's called How to Lie with Statistics by Daryl Huff, and it was written in 1954. And pretty much everything that is in it is still very applicable to present day. And you can see this happening on either side of the political aisle in Canada and in the US, where politicians can take the same data point and cut it up into so many different ways and tell a completely different story. And so one of my goals is really to try and cut through a lot of that BS, let's call it, and give you an honest look at what's actually happening in Canada's economy, which is that we probably will see the fastest economic growth in the G7 next year. And at the same time, our per capita GDP will probably be the lowest in the G7 next year. And I'll leave it up to you to decide which metric matters more to you. But let me know what you think in the comments, and I'd love to have a discussion about it. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.